Parashah 4, Vayera. He appeared. We began our readings this morning by jumping back into Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 17, where YHVH had actually said to Avraham in verses 7 and 8, I am establishing my covenant between me and you, along with all your descendants after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant to be God for you and for your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land which you are now foreigners, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. The important point of these verses is the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham. It was for all the land of Canaan. As we saw in last week's Parashah, that territory was everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that is, from east to west, and from the border of Lebanon down to the Wadi of Egypt, which is in the Sinai Peninsula, that is, from north to south. The whole territory also included the Gaza Strip. Therefore, all the land of Canaan is what we now know, of course, as Eretz Israel. However, because Yahweh put Avraham in a deep sleep while the covenant was being cut, he later bound Avraham into that covenant by giving him a directive that he had to be circumcised, and all the males in his household likewise. Circumcision became the everlasting sign of that covenant in the flesh of both Avraham and all his descendants through each subsequent generation. So chapter 17 concludes with the words, Avraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised. Avraham and Ishmael his son were circumcised on the same day, and all the men of his household, both slaves born in the house and those bought with money from other foreigners, were circumcised with him. Ishmael, he was not the one who was to inherit the territory covered by the covenant. However, earlier in that chapter, we're told that Sarah would give birth to Yitzchak, and that he and his direct descendants would be the ones that would inherit all the land of Canaan. As for Ishmael, I have blessed him, and I have made him fruitful and given him many descendants. He will be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Now this is the first expression of the divide between Jews and Arabs. But as modern history shows, and has played out more particularly since the end of the First World War, the Arab nations, because they were also circumcised descendants of Abraham, claimed the territory west of the Jordan River, because they are the firstborn of Abraham. Having established the basis of the animosity between the descendants of the two sons of Abraham, we can now move on and consider today's Parashah, Vayera. At the opening words in chapter 18, Yahweh appears to Avraham by the oaks of Mamre, while Avraham was still recovering from the circumcision. In verse 2, Avraham raises his eyes, looks, and there in front of him stood 3 men. On seeing them, he ran out from the tent to meet them. The Jewish community break up each parashah into 7 portions, which they call in Hebrew Aliyah or Eliot. But today I want to focus on just the 6th and 7th portions, which are from chapter 21, verse 22, right through to the end of chapter 22. Those 2 portions of this parashah address matters that are related to the modern state of Israel and the current situation it is facing. Following the destruction of S'dom and Amora, Avraham went to the place where he had spoken with Yahweh, and looked over towards S'dom and Amora. There was smoke still rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. God had destroyed the cities of the plain. Avraham doubtless wondered what had become of his nephew Lot and his family. Had they been destroyed in the destruction? Scripture does not say whether Yahweh told Avraham that the angels had saved Lot and his daughters, so we can assume that Avraham was grieving for the cities and also for Lot and his family. But in chapter 20, we see Avraham and his family moving away from the oaks of Mamre, which were near to Hebron, and we see him heading southward toward the Negev, and he and Sarah lived in Kadesh and Shur for an unspecified period. They moved on from the Negev to Gerar, which is close to the border of what we now know as the Gaza Strip. It was while Avraham and Sarah were living in Gerar that Avraham had his first encounter with Avimelech, the king of the Philistine. It was Avimelech who stole Sarah, taking her to be his wife, because Avraham had passed her off as being his sister. However, in chapter 20, verses 2 through 13, Avraham had not lied when he called her his sister, because in verses 12 through 13, Avraham said, "She is actually also my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. So she became my wife. When God had me leave my father's house, I told her, 'Do me a favor. Wherever we go, say about me, he is my brother.'" So before Avimelech had actually slept with Sarah, Yahweh intervened and made her true relationship with Yahweh known to Avimelech. God came to Avimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman that you have taken, since she is someone else's wife." Then Yahweh appeared again to Avimelech in another dream, warning him that if he kept on sinning, he himself would die. Yahweh further warned Avimelech to return Sarah to Avraham. "Therefore, return the man's wife to him now. He is a prophet, and he will pray for you, so that you will live. But if you don't return her, know that you certainly will die, and along with you all your family." So instead of killing Avraham, Avimelech, fearing the God of Israel and the God of Abraham, returned Sarah to Abraham, along with many sheep, cattle, and human slaves. Then Avimelech went even further in verse 15 by saying, "Look, my country lies before you. You can live there." So the harmony was restored between the two men. Avraham had learned a hard lesson, that he needed to trust on Yahweh in all matters. He did not need to conceal his true relationship with Sarah. Even in this modern age, people in positions of authority often abuse their station in life, calling for unjustified sexual favors from their subordinates. Nothing has changed, even though the majority of the human race has advanced well beyond the base levels of that ancient time. There still are these same practices occurring year after year in the modern world. So moving on, we see that while Abraham and Sarah were living near the territory of the Philistine, Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak, as Yahweh had foretold the year earlier. That leads us into chapter 21, which begins by dealing with the problems that developed between Ishmael and Yitzchak. By the time Yitzchak was 3 years old, the family dynamics had reached the point where Hagar and Yishma'el were forced to leave the family camp. The first 21 verses deal with the trauma faced by Hagar and Yishma'el in the desert near Beersheba. However, the angel of Yahweh intervened and saved them both from an early death. Life appears to have continued on harmoniously for Avraham and Avimelech until we come to verse 22 and onward through to the end of that chapter, where the problem has arisen between the two men over the ownership of wells. It was Avraham who complained to Avimelech about the provocation of the servants of Avimelech who had seized a well which Avraham had dug. But Avimelech retorts by denying any knowledge of this problem right up until that day. It was doubtless a complete communication breakdown, but the matter was resolved when Avraham offered sheep and cattle to Avimelech in the form of a covenant. In response, Avimelech says in verses 22 through 24, he and Pichol, his commander, spoke to Avraham. They said, God is with you in everything you do. Therefore swear to me, by God, that you will never deal with us falsely, but according to kindness, the kindness which we have treated you, you will treat me and the land in which you have lived as a foreigner. Abraham's response was, I swear it. The swearing of that oath between the two men took place in the place which Avraham later called Beersheba, meaning the well of an oath. When they had finished making their covenant, Amalek departed with Pichol, his commander of the army, and returned to the land of the Philistine. Avraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. Avraham lived a long time as a foreigner in the land of the Philistine. All this seems completely harmless. A covenant made between two neighbors that enabled Avraham to dwell a long time in the Philistine territory with a lasting assurance that his wells would be protected from the willful actions of Avimelech's servants. But if we cast our mind back to chapter 15 and also 17 verses 7 and 8, we are reminded that Yahweh had already made his covenant with Avraham. In the words we read earlier, I am establishing my covenant between me and you, along with your descendants, after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant. So by making a covenant with Avimelech, Avraham violated his covenantal arrangement with Yahweh. The land of the Philistine was a portion of the land promised by Yahweh to all Abraham's descendants in every generation. It was all the land of the Canaan that would be the rightful inheritance of Abraham and his descendants. Yet by swearing an oath with Avimelech, Avraham had agreed that the Philistine portion of the territory would remain the rightful possession of the Philistine. The result has been that all generations of Abraham's descendants who have ever dwelt in the land of Eretz Israel have had to contend with the constant invasions from the coastal territories, which by right belong to Israel, not to the Philistine or any other people groups. As we saw last Shabbat, the covenant that was ratified by the smoking firepot and the flaming torch meant that the eternal covenant had been made in the celestial realm. Hence, the adversary has used every human leader and various national groups who have occupied the Gaza Strip to be a constant plague against the people of Israel. The only way the 7th of October invasion by Hamas will finally end well for Israel is by Israel turning back to Yahweh, in accordance, of course, with the call that has been repeated numerous times throughout the Torah and the prophets, and finally by Yeshua himself in person. Only when that happens will the adversary be fully curtailed, as we know from Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, where it says, I saw an angel come down from heaven who had a key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, and Satan, the adversary, and chained him up for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, locked it and sealed it over him, so that he could not deceive the nations any more until the 1,000 years were over. So until the chaining of the adversary occurs, Israel need to call on Yahweh for help and support, just as he has shown them many times in both ancient times and modern. Think of the 4 major wars that have occurred since Israel became a state: 1948, 56, 67, and 73. And now, 50 years on from that, they are at a point where yet again they need to call on Yahweh to support the IDF. Israel needs to heed the words of Psalm 18, which we read earlier. Only by following those mighty words will Israel achieve the success it needs against Hamas and the rest of the axis of evil. Yet it has been suggested by some that the IDF only need to heed the words of verses 38 and 39 to be successful. Those verses say, I pursued my enemies and overtook them without turning back until they were destroyed. I crushed them so that they can't get up. They have fallen under my feet. And those words alone will not bring an everlasting solution unless the rest of that psalm is added. And moving on into chapter 22, Yahweh placed upon Avraham the ultimate test, which is known, of course, in the Jewish community as the Akedah, which means the binding, where Avraham was told in verse 2, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzchak, and go to the land of Moriah. There you are to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will point out to you. Now in this verse, there are 3 important features which need to be considered carefully. But time is such that we can only consider the first one. We'll consider more closely next week about the land of Moriah and the burnt offering. So what about Yitzchak, your only son? The story of the Akedah is all about the binding of Yitzchak. However, the narrative itself is a very complex scriptural drama, which, when read at face value, appears to show Avraham as a man constrained by a high degree of passivity. Why did Avraham not challenge Yahweh as he had done just before the destruction of Sodom? Was it because he'd been given a direct command by Yahweh? As we see later in later Parashah, Moshe also challenged Yahweh on more than one occasion when Yahweh was about to destroy the nation of Israel. So why was Avraham so passive in this situation? Surely there must be a deeper and hidden significance. Looking to Professor Aaron Kohler of the Near Eastern Studies, Yeshiva University, he suggests traditional commentators have long tried to mitigate the problems with this story, both on God's part and Abraham's, in such a way as to make all parties ethical. And yet there has always been, even among the traditional readers, an undercurrent of unease about this story. His words clearly show that there is no real consensus, either historically or modern, as to why the whole dramatic event appears to portray such passivity on the part of Avraham. I believe the whole drama was intended as an ultimate test on one man who up to that point had always shown implicit trust in God. Yet at times, of course, he also expressed human weakness. When we think back Twice he had passed Sarah off as his sister to save his own life. Then, as we have considered, about how when he entered into the covenant with Avimelech, he stood in the way of the covenant Yahweh had made with him, which through circumcision had become a sealed covenant. However, the ultimate test, which he's just experienced, proved that he could be trusted. Thus, he was considered righteous by Yahweh. Now, Shaul brings forth in Romans chapter 4 how through the trusting of Avraham walked with Yahweh. Shaul also shows how, having paid the ultimate price by giving his own life, Yeshua also proved that he was totally trustworthy. I also believe that through the test upon Avraham, Yahweh was showing the adversary that Avraham truly was a man who could be trusted to bring forth descendants who would become a blessing to all the nations of the earth. What we have considered in the Akedah drama is a close reflection of the narrative that we read in Eov or Job, chapters 1 and 2, along, of course, with the final outcome of that situation in Eov 42, verses 7 through 16, where Eov has his fortunes restored, which is similar to what happened with Avraham. In his old age, he also fathered many sons. When we consider the narrative of Eov 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Etzu whose name was Eov. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. The name Eov could well be replaced with Avraham, because the character of those two men is clearly interchangeable. Both Avraham and Eov expressed implicit trust in Yahweh, and through their trust, they were both found to be pleasing to Yahweh. Both were wealthy men. So how could their trust be tested beyond doubt? Eov, in chapter 1, we see that the adversary enters into the court of heaven. It happened one day that the sons of God came to serve Yahweh, and among them came the adversary. Yahweh asked the adversary, "Where have you come from?" And the adversary answered Yahweh, "From roaming through the earth, wandering here and there." The adversary challenges Yahweh to prove the integrity of Eov. As we read in verses 8 through 12, the words can also be applied to Avraham in the Akedah drama. By commanding Avraham to offer Yitzchak as a burnt offering, Yahweh proves to the adversary that Avraham could be trusted, even under the most dire circumstances. With the words of Avraham in Bereshit 22:18, "Because you obeyed my orders," Yahweh proved that the adversary, who was constantly doubting the ability of these men, was proved to be an absolute liar. The same actions and reactions can be seen throughout chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Eov. And in each situation, the name of Avraham could well replace Eov, and still the outcome would be the same. As we read, when Eov passed his test and was found totally blameless and trustworthy, Yahweh blessed him with increased wealth, long life, and a whole new family. The same applied to Avraham, as we will see in the next couple of parashahs, how things worked out for Avraham following the Akedah drama. Avraham had to pass the ultimate test to prove the adversary truly is the father of lies. Also, as we read in Romans chapter 4, Yeshua had to pass the ultimate test by passing up his own life, that he could be the one and only chosen Son of God. So in conclusion, what can we learn from all these experiences of Avraham throughout all his troublesome years? Firstly, it was clear that his life was that of a nomad. He also showed human weaknesses, as we've seen today. Avraham, by making a covenant with Avimelech, opened the door for the people groups of the Gaza Strip to become a constant threat to the people of Israel, both ancient and modern. The last attack by Hamas was launched primarily against the supernova musical festivals in the Negev, which was being celebrated by 3,000 young Israeli people who claimed to belong to what they had called the tribe of Noah. Their presence in that particular place at that particular time, which was the end of the festival of Sukkot, Yahweh's festival, is a sad indictment on the whole religious establishment of modern Israel. Why did the young people have to turn to Eastern religions rather than turning to their God? Both the rabbinical and the Messianic communities need to wake up and recognize the fact that that massacre was an indication of the situation that Israel finds itself in now. And it is time, once again, to draw themselves back to their God and have trust in Yahweh. Just as Psalm 18 said, the IDF will fight, but only when Yahweh supports them will they come out with the right solution. So next week, we will look at how Yitzchak dealt with Avimelech and how things worked out for him during his lifetime, and how that has also had an impact on how modern Israel today is still being confronted with the same problems from a part of the territory that belongs to them by right through the covenant that was made by Yahweh himself. Only when they come to the realization of all these things will things be restored to the way they're meant to be with the return of Yeshua. Shabbat Shalom.